Hey everyone, this is Greg with Spotted Tongue Woodworking, and in this video, I'm going to show you how... Oh, shit. Well, that's not good. We'll get back to that. Alright, let's try this again. I'm Greg with Spotted Tongue Woodworking, and in this video, I'm going to be building a round white oak table. Not just any round white oak table, but an expanding white oak table with a built-in butterfly leaf. After picking through my lumber and figuring out the boards that will be for the tops and the boards that will be for the legs, I cut everything down to length and then rip the wide boards down to width so that they would fit on my jointer. I have an 8-inch jointer, these are more than 8 inches. After that, joint one face, joint one edge, and move on to the planer, and to get everything nice and squared away to be able to be turned into a tabletop. With a project like this, I really believe grain orientation is a very important part of what you do, so I spent a good amount of time getting my boards lined up and figuring out exactly which board goes where to get a nice grain flow across the whole top. This isn't the first round table that I've made, but this is the first round extending table I've made. And the way I figured to do it was to figure out my layout and then the center board to actually cut that board in half and to end up gluing everything in two halves rather than gluing it all together and then cutting it half at the end. In my mind, that makes it easier to manhandle and to control gluing up two halves rather than trying to glue up the whole thing and manhandle the whole top together at one time. That is one thing I did struggle with the walnut round table I made earlier this year. It was heavy and it was hard. But for the purposes of gluing this up, I cut biscuits into each of the boards. The biscuits help with the alignment of the boards when gluing them up. Put glue on them, Type Bond 3, very nice waterproof glue, and after gluing it up, setting the biscuits in place, I will then clamp them all into position, making sure everything is nice and flush. When clamping up a larger glue-up tabletop like this, not only do you want to have clamps on the bottom side, you also want to have clamps on the top side to equalize the pressure and help ensure that you have a nice flat glue-up. After letting each glue-up sit overnight, come back, unclamp them after a 24 hours cure time, and unclamp them. Check for flatness, and I was very happy with how these glued up. Very nice, very flat across the whole piece. And we'll move on to the drum sander to get everything nice and flat and sanded out. And this is just another part where I was really thankful that I glued it up into two halves and I was able to work each half independently. These halves definitely maxed out these drum sanders, really put them through their paces. After sanding each half nice and flush to the same thickness, we're going to stick the two halves together. I was going to use super glue on the painter's tape to stick the halves together. That didn't work, and I ended up just clamping the two halves together. It's not a big deal, they just have to be tight enough that the circle is a complete circle as the router goes around. And the same problem that as I had earlier this year, you can't really get a 54-inch circle jig. You really have to make your own when you're making these larger size tables. So I learned from the jig I made in the spring. I made a new one with a bigger router on it, and I was very happy with how this turned out. And when I say I put a bigger router on the jig, this is actually my grandfather's Makita router, and this thing is a monster. It's a single speed, 3 horsepower router. It goes fast, it goes hard, and it holds nothing back. Then using a nice compression spiral Freud bit and a very clean, powerful cut. Zero tear out. Very happy with the quality of the cut through this, going around and around and around. And this time I actually did not cut all the way through because the pieces were clamped. If I had cut all the way through, the circle would have actually fallen apart as I was cutting it. So what we're going to do is going to come through with the jigsaw, cut off these extra pieces, and then finish it up with the flush trim bit on the trim router, and clean those edges up, and we'll have to come back and sand them when we go to finish. And then it's time to move on to the leaf itself. It is an 18-inch wide leaf. It'll be 54 inches long because it's a 54-inch table. 54 inches cut in half, so two 27-inch leaves that will fold onto each other like butterfly wings. You can see here how the two halves will fit in the center of the table, and we'll move on to cutting the concealed hinges into place. And we'll be using the SOSS or SOS concealed hinges. The key with these is that you have to cut out the mortises inside the edge of each of the piece that you are working on. You can either use a router or you can use a drill and a Forstner bit to cut it out. After cutting out the waste with the drill, finish chopping out the rest with the chisel to get a nice, clean, tight fit for these hinges to fit inside that mortise. You can see how the hinge fits inside the edge of the top and how the hinge folds in on itself, and you will do that on both sides of the leaf so that it will fold over, again, like the wings of a butterfly. And what's a tabletop without a base? Here we are going to start working on the legs. This is a unique design in that it is technically a fixed base or almost a pedestal base round table, but it will have 4 legs, and in the middle of those 4 legs it will actually have a lower shelf to use for storage. These legs will be a 2.5-inch square when they are finished, so I will have to glue up 2 1.25-inch pieces to be able to get that square at the end. The key with gluing up table legs like this is trying to match the grain orientation as best you can so that you don't actually see the glue line and that it appears to be a solid piece of wood. After gluing up all of the leg blanks, I will square them up again on the jointer across one glue edge and one face edge, run them through the planer, bring them to that final 2.5-inch thickness, and we'll move on to cutting the bridle joints out of the top of these legs. There was a lot of interesting engineering problems with constructing this table, the way it is made with the four-legged base and the expanding butterfly top. What I decided to do was to cut bridle joints out of the top, and I will slide the one side of the apron into that bridle joint, and that will provide a lot of the strength and the security of the tabletop and keep everything in place. There are a lot of different ways to do this. I opted to use the bandsaw to cut out all the kerfs, and then I was able to cut out all the extra on the bandsaw, coming around that edge and clean it up with a chisel. And from here we'll move on to the apron itself. Maybe apron isn't the best term to use for this portion of it. It is just part of the table base itself. These will hold the table slide extensions. As you can see, I am cutting out the notches that will sit around the bridle joint. It is almost like a double bridle joint that will be fitted together, and it'll be an immensely strong joint doing it that way. And then the bridle joint will only be for one orientation of the table. Obviously I have to fit everything back together the other way, and I have to fit the butterfly leaf in between all of these legs as well. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to use mortise and tenon joint for the braces in the other direction, cut out most of the waste with the Forstner bit, come back with the chisel, square everything up. I'm actually going to leave the edges rounded, and when I cut the tenons on the table saw, again I can go slowly with the dado stack and ensure an exact and perfect fit, slowly but surely moving it slowly up all the way around, and that just allows me to be sure that it is not going to be loose, it's not going to be sloppy, that when I put the pieces together they're going to be tight and they are going to hold each other without really having to use the glue. And because I had left the rounded edges in the mortises, I'm just going to chop off the corners of these tenons so that they will fit into the mortises. These corners don't matter, it is really the cheeks of the tenon inside the mortise that are going to provide much of the holding power. And there you can see, it's a nice, snug, tight fit that's really going to hold itself together. And if you think that joint is nice, here is a backwards shot of putting the bridle joint in, because I didn't get it forwards. Alright, so enough about that mistake. Now we're going to move on to putting together the lower shelf, and it's fairly straightforward. I'm just going to cut a couple boards, I'm going to glue them all together, and after gluing them all together I'm going to clamp them, and after I clamp them I'm going to sand them, and after I sand them I'm going to do something a little different. Actually, that's a lie. I'm going to square them up and then I'm going to do something different. So in the top of the table base, we're going to have a bridle joint, or we're going to have a mortise and tenon joint, and then for this shelf, we're going to have a sliding dovetail. It's not pretty. Well, I'm not going to say it's not pretty. It actually looks pretty good. But it's just a small half-inch sliding dovetail, and what that's going to do is the orientation of the dovetail, when it is pushed into place, it is actually going to pull that mortise and tenon joint tighter together and hold the table together. I can basically balance on the table without any glue. I can swing on it and it holds itself together because of the strength of that traditional joinery. And this is just a little decorative element that I think is a nice touch and a nice thing to show my process of making a little router jig to cut out a curved base. I actually used the template from my bent lamination jig to make a curve, cut that arc out, and I'm actually going to cut that arc into the table base itself. And speaking of my bent lamination jig, that's where we're headed. This table, is a round table. It needs a round apron. That's why I was slightly hesitant to call what I was doing earlier the apron of the table. It's just the base of the table. So for a bent lamination, it's very straightforward. I'm going to cut a lot of skinny strips, and after I cut a lot of skinny strips, probably about 9 pieces at just under 1/8 of an inch thick, I'm going to bend them all together inside this form. This form is a 52-inch circle. When it rebounds, it'll be a 53-inch semicircle. Glue everything together, slap everything into place, clamp it nice and tight, let it sit overnight, pop it out of there, and voila, you have a curved piece of wood. Or I guess technically it's a curved plywood. It's a bent lamination. But it's a neat little trick. It looks great, and it is a wonderful, easy way to truly elevate your woodworking game. And it's also a lot of fun to wrestle this over the joiner and to wrestle it through the planer, trying to put a curved piece through something that is traditionally used for a straight piece of wood. And we're getting closer to the final stretches here. And one of the biggest difficulties with the butterfly leaf, it's all difficult. It's all frustrating because there's not a lot out there, but it's actually finding the hardware for the pivot for the butterfly leaf. And I opted to make my own. I wanted something custom that matched the table, and so I have a white oak surround. I'm going to have a copper and steel pipe running through the middle of it, and that is what the whole mechanism is going to turn on. It is solid, it looks good, and it's going to match the table, which is, what else can I ask for? And skipping forward through a lot of the thinking and the frustration of trying to figure out the actual pivot of the butterfly leaf, which I'll get to towards the end of the video. I put the table together, without any glue, though the joints held, so I was really happy with that. And putting the table together, got the leaf lined up, everything really nice the way it is. Sand the edges, make sure everything lines up both with the table shut and with the table open. After sanding the edges, making sure everything was nice and smooth all the way around, route the top edges with the router and take the table apart. Still had to taper the legs, so make my taper jig, a nice shaker style tapered on the bottom. And now for the finish sanding. What we're going to do is we're going to ease the edges of these legs. The white oak edges are sharp, so I'm going to take a hand plane, take those corners down, come back with the orbital sander, sand everything down to 120 grit, and again, take the top off. I have to route the underside of the top as well. We're just going to match the profile top and bottom for a nice bullnose effect. Finish sanding. Again, it's very boring. Not a whole lot. Just sanding, 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 and sanding. Bent lamination. Oh, look, I am sanding again. Still sanding. And after sanding, a nice round over on the edges. 1/4 inch round over means that each of the laminated pieces, it does not cross over. It looks like a solid piece of wood. Finish off, hand sand that round over, and we'll go on to the finishing stage after final assembly. And I was truly and honestly amazed by how quickly and easily this base went together. The bridle joints the mortise and tenon, the sliding dovetails, it held together. I almost didn't clamp it, but I realized that I should, just for good practice. And for all the haters out there, yes, I will be using Rubio Monocoat. I'm really happy with the finish, happy with the colors, and that's what we'll be doing. And for those of you who don't know, Rubio Monocoat is a hard wax oil that actually forms a molecular bond with the wood when it is fully cured. And a neat little trick with any sort of wooden slide, be it a drawer slide or a table extension, is that the wood doesn't slide smoothly, so you can add a little bit of paste wax that, when it cures, will add a nice slick surface and it'll slide very smoothly. I'll be using figure 8 fasteners to attach the apron to each of the table halves. Bob over at Garage Dwellers Woodworking has a wonderful video on how to attach these. He'll go into a lot more depth than I did. But there it is. The apron is attached to the tabletop. I will attach the tabletop to the slides, and I'll have to trim the apron to the size of the tabletops by hand with my handsaw. And that was just one of those woodworking operations that I couldn't think of a better way to do it, but it scared the crap out of me knowing that a simple mess up would ruin this entire project. Now that we are on the final stages of the table build, the table has been assembled, it is all glued together, and now we're going to end up, before we do the finish sanding, we're just going to flatten the top a little bit, take a variety of hand planes and hand scrapers. The scraper tool is a very wonderful tool to really finesse these edges and make them nice and flush. The key is to not only flush up the leaves, but also the table shut, so that when it's open with the leaf, the edges are flush. Close the leaf, close the table, edges are flush. It's a little tricky. Finish sanding, so 80 grit, 120 grit. I went to 240 grit. Water pop it, and after water popping it, letting it dry, bring it back down to 120 grit. Water popping allows the Rubio Monocoat to absorb more deeply and more richly into the wood. It will also keep the grain from getting fuzzy if you were to ever wash the table or get a little bit of water on the table, so that you won't have any of that reaction. Because it forms a molecular bond with the wood, you need to get all the dust off of the table, so we will vacuum all the dust off. I'll wipe it all down after that with a microfiber cloth and then clean it with mineral spirits to make sure that there is nothing on the table. And after making sure that the table is completely clean, that there is no loose dust on there, that it is sanded and water popped, sanded, and all of the above, it's time to apply the final coats of Rubio Monocoat. The top is Rubio Monocoat Chocolate. We were going for a rich walnut look, which ironically I don't think you can really get from the actual walnut color. So we go with chocolate for what I call walnut a rich chocolate brown. So we got a rich chocolate brown with that, and that's it. Wipe on the Rubio Monocoat, let it dry, and the table is done. It opens, shuts. It is a wonderful, beautiful table. And I'll be honest, my original intention for this table was for it to be done by the end of 2022. Obviously, if you're just watching this video, which will be released in 2023, I didn't finish the table in 2022. I just finished it right at the beginning of 2023, finished the video in 2023, but I think it's a good way to start the year. This is a fantastic project. I think it's a real good showcase of a variety of woodworking skills, both with machinery and with hand tools, along with the engineering and figuring out the mechanics of the butterfly leaf itself. This is a project that I can be proud of. If you made it this far, thank you. If you enjoyed this video, if you got something from it, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, spread the word. Spotted Tongue Woodworking, baby.